Good morning to our audience in the United States. Good afternoon to our audience in Europe. Hello, wherever you are. We find that when the subject involves Ireland, we get a global viewership. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and we're broadcasting from the Atlantic Council's headquarters and new studio. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event with Ireland Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence, Simon Coveney. Minister Coveney joins us here in Washington, D.C. in person after being in New York for the 76th session of the United States General Assembly. The United Nations has a special significance to Ireland always, but particularly right now, as Ireland is both an elected member of the United Nations Security Council and holder of its rotating presidency for the month of September. The minister will talk to us about this, but Ireland has been in this seat of president of the Security Council at interesting moments in history, and I hope he'll speak to that. As a member of the European Union, a member of the UN Security Council, and a country with such strong ties to the United States of so many dimensions, Ireland is at the table on a number of crucial issues that are driving the foreign policy space. And what a month it has been. Humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan still looms large. COVID-19 is still an ever-present challenge. European relations with the United States remain tense in some respects, and there are issues all around the world giving rise to waves of refugees as well. Closer to home in Ireland, the post-Brexit debate represents a continued challenge for Ireland, for the European Union, and for the transatlantic community, and particularly when it comes to the issue of Northern Ireland. Many members of Congress and senators follow this issue closely, and President Biden has been passionate for many years on the issue of peace in Northern Ireland as a senator, as vice president, as presidential candidate, and now as President of the United States. Just this week, President Biden warned British Prime Minister Boris Johnson that peace in Northern Ireland must not be jeopardized by post-Brexit trade deals. Let me quote President Biden. "I feel strongly," he said, "we spent an enormous amount of time and effort in the United States. It was a major partisan effort, and I would not like to see, nor would many of my Republican colleagues, a change in the Irish Accord." There are very few international issues that have as much domestic resonance as this one. So, we are very interested to hear from you, Minister Coveney, about Ireland's stance on these issues, but also your larger view now as President of the UN Security Council. Minister Coveney is a leading voice for Ireland in the Brexit debate and has taken an active role in negotiations on the Northern Ireland protocols on which so much of the post-Brexit debate rests. Mr. Coveney is also well-versed in Ireland's foreign policy priorities, serving as the country's foreign minister since 2017, and now simultaneously as the country's defense minister since 2020. We look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Minister, about Ireland's foreign policy priorities for the European Union, for its bilateral relations with the United States, and for the transatlantic community. Before I turn over to one of the people I most like and admire in the journalistic community, Mary Jordan, national correspondent of the Washington Post, to moderate this discussion, I invite you all to follow along and submit questions on Zoom using the Q&A function on Zoom, or on Twitter using the hashtag ACEurope, hashtag ACEurope. We're on the record. Minister Coveney, welcome again, and Mary, over to you.
Delighted to be here, and I wanted just to underscore, we do welcome, as you hear things, please send us questions, and I'll do my best over the next hour to get them. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Why don't we start with Brexit, since there is so much concern about the effect that that is going to have on the border. And the border is, critical part of the Good Friday Agreement and the protocol that everyone's talking about was that people and goods could go across that border without any kind of checks. And now, of course, Brexit has all kinds of concerns because the EU, of course, has its own customs. So how do you see this getting resolved and when?
Well, I mean, first of all, the Brexit debates have gone on now for years. And we knew that when the United Kingdom made a democratic decision to leave the European Union, that the Irish issues linked to that were going to be very complex to resolve. And the reason for that is that peace on the island of Ireland between North and South, which was agreed in the context of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago, really was reinforced by that agreement, which created an absence of violence and therefore a removal of the security checks needed, particularly in the border region between North and South. But because of our joint membership of the European Union and its single market and customs union, there was also no trade border either. And so the combination of EU membership for Britain and Ireland, as well as the peace process that was successful, meant that there was commonality, North and South on the island, and East-West between Britain and Ireland, of economic regulation, trade, free movement of goods and services and people. And so it created an atmosphere of normality and trade and interaction. The problem is that Brexit changes all of that and actually has a stated objective of moving away from that status, because what Brexit is attempting to do is to create difference between the UK and the EU, is creating a new unilateral decision-making process in Britain around its own regulations, its own interaction with the rest of the world, and so on. And that is, of course, a legitimate course for the UK to take. I don't happen to agree with that decision, but I respect it, because any country is entitled to decide on its own future. But Britain is not entitled to decide on Ireland's future because of a democratic decision. And so we have had long and difficult debates on how do you deal with maintaining an all-island economy between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. How do you deal with maintaining free movement, which is the basis for improved and sustained relationships post-peace agreement in 1998. And this has proven to be the most difficult issue to resolve in the Brexit debates, because the kind of Brexit that this current British government insisted upon, which was to leave the European Union in a very clear-cut way, and therefore having to find a solution for the Irish question became much more complicated than it needed to be. So what I mean by that is that the European Union had on offer a shared customs union, a shared single market, solutions that would have applied to all of the UK in terms of joint agreements on standards and so on. The British government decided they didn't want that. They wanted firm and complete separation. And so we had to put a Northern Ireland specific solution in place that could prevent any need for border infrastructure to re-emerge between North and South, which would have been politically and practically, in my view, impossible to implement. And the result became the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, which in simple terms meant that the EU agreed to extend its single market for goods to Northern Ireland outside of the EU, because Northern Ireland, as part of the United Kingdom, has left the EU. And as a result of that, there will be no need for border checks north and south, but there is a need for some level of checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland now, because that is essentially an entry point into the EU single market for goods. And that's what is now the source of so much political strife.
Such as the so-called sausage wars and
Yeah, no, but I mean,
but the
I mean, look,
paperwork and the problems
yeah.
that this has caused, how will it?
No, but just to be clear, like, language like the sausage wars is language used by people who are trying to change the conversation here. Let's be very clear on what the Irish Protocol is and how it came about. The Irish Protocol was a British and EU joint solution to manage the disruption of Brexit on the island of Ireland. It was designed by, ratified by, campaigned on the back of by the British government in the build-up to their successful general election result. It is part of an international treaty that the British Prime Minister has signed up to. So this idea that all of a sudden the British government is now saying, well, we can't work with the protocol, the EU are being unreasonable, it has to change, we need to amend it. The truth is that this is their protocol as well as the EU's. They have equal ownership of it, and it was designed by them as well as us and the EU together to try to limit the disruption as best we could from the fallout of Brexit on the island of Ireland. That being said, we recognise in the Irish government that there are real problems with its implementation, despite the fact that everybody agreed the protocol and also agreed, by the way, an implementation plan for the protocol last December, which is also being ignored largely on the British side in terms of unilateral action that they've taken, contrary to the commitments they've made. But to be honest with you, we need to talk less about who's at fault here and who's to blame, and more about how do we solve the outstanding issues that are impacting on Northern Ireland in a very negative way.
But when we're talking, even though it is the famous British press headlines about sausage wars, it goes to the point about day-to-day life is going to be made harder, already has been, about the paperwork and some of the complications. And quite a lot of people think that maybe this is going to have a pretty big impact on the fragile piece there.
Yeah, and that's what we need to fix. But let's be clear, the disruptor here is Brexit. If you leave a union, if you leave a single market and you leave a customs union, don't expect that you can continue on to trade as you did before.
So what does the UK need to do?
So the protocol tries to manage that disruption, to limit the paperwork as much as possible. But clearly for many people in Northern Ireland, for the unionist community in particular, the idea that there are any checks at all needed on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, when as they see it, that is the United Kingdom and its internal market. Many people have a problem with that, and like with so much in Northern Ireland, it impacts on people's identity, and we have to try to address that, and we are trying to address it. I think you will see in the coming weeks a package of proposals coming from the EU side to try to look at the maximum possible flexibility in terms of implementing the protocol, looking at ways in which we can reduce the need for checks on goods, that we can do more in terms of online and pre-registration and so on in terms of managing customs arrangements, that we can look at a more risk-based approach. And what I mean by that is that goods that we know are staying in Northern Ireland and not leaking across the border into the EU single market. And if we can prove and show that, can we reduce the checks burden on those goods?
And you think that will be coming soon?
I think yes. I think you will see a package of measures that the EU are working with the British government on to try to resolve some of the practical issues that are causing real tension in Northern Ireland. And just for the audience to understand why this really matters, because my description may come across as, sort of technical trading arrangements. The largest party in Northern Ireland, which is a unionist party, the DUP, has said that if the issues around the protocol and its implementation can't be resolved, then they are going to collapse the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. They're going to pull out of the executive, the assembly, in other words, the devolved government structures in Northern Ireland. They have already pulled out of what's called North-South cooperation, which is an absolutely fundamental pillar of the peace agreement in Ireland, where there is structured cooperation north and south between the Irish government and the political institutions in Northern Ireland. So we are in a serious and threatening place in the context of the foundations for peace and better relations on the island of Ireland, which is the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions that it set up.
So we've seen how fragile...
And unfortunately, the protocol, which is trying to resolve problems linked to Brexit, has become now this intense totem, if you like, in politics in Northern Ireland, which has caused deep divisions and polarization. And we need to make sure that that polarization doesn't spill over into a damaging period that undermines relationships and a peace agreement that the United States has been such a strong guarantor for the last 23 years. I mean, don't forget, from Washington's perspective, one of the most significant foreign policy achievements of the last 30 or 40 years has been peace on the island of Ireland and the role that the United States has played on that. And that's why you see President Biden, that's why you see Speaker Pelosi, that's why you see Chairman Neil speaking so directly and so bluntly to the United Kingdom in terms of their concern that the fallout and consequence of Brexit cannot result in Ireland and the peace process on the island of Ireland being a casualty of that.
And are you concerned, and could you explain how concerned, just to underline it, that violence, are you worried about violence? Are you worried about damage to the local institutions? Are you worried, what exactly are you worried could happen if this is not resolved in a way that it's such a fragile place.
Yeah, it is a fragile place. It's a special place, Northern Ireland. It's an amazing place in many ways. There's a lot of great people there, but it is a very polarized society. It has a small population, but it's a population, some of whom identify as Irish, as Irish as I am, coming from Cork on the south coast of Ireland. And some identify as British, and that is very important to them. Others, an increasing number actually, aren't willing to identify specifically as either, but want to classify themselves as Northern Irish. But we managed to, and when I say we, the international community, the British government and the Irish government, just over 23 years ago, managed to achieve something extraordinary. It was a peace agreement that ended decades of conflict that resulted in 40,000 people being injured, 4,000 people being killed in a really brutal and tragic period in Irish and Northern Irish history. And that agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, or some call it the Belfast Agreement, involved many actors, including many from the United States, were central to that. And so the institutions and the structures that agreement set up since then has been the basis for a new relationship, a better relationship, a much more hopeful relationship in terms of looking to the future for Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of the Brexit journey has been to undermine the relationships that are at the heart of that Good Friday Agreement, because it forces questions that are very difficult and uncomfortable to answer in Northern Ireland.
And so, just to end this part, but how serious is this? How worried are you?
Well, I mean, I'm working night and day to try to address the friction around the protocol so that we can get back to focusing on a functioning Northern Ireland that operates the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, that has a good relationship with the government in Dublin, and that functions in a way that allows Irish people to feel Irish, British people to feel British, and others to feel comfortable living in Northern Ireland. That is not where we are at the moment. And I don't want to start predicting violence, but I can certainly predict a lot of political instability and tension in Northern Ireland in the absence of functioning institutions. And those institutions are under threat because of an inability to be able to implement what was agreed under the Brexit agreements, which, let's not forget, is an international treaty and is international law and has legal obligations that need to be followed through on. And The challenge here for politicians like me and others is, can we find a way of implementing what was agreed in a way that reduces tension, responds to legitimate concerns expressed by the unionist community in Northern Ireland in a real and pragmatic way? And can we be ambitious about showing that kind of flexibility in the weeks ahead before this issue really gets out of hand, which it is risking doing at the moment?
Do you agree with those who think that Brexit, even if unintentionally, is going to increase the enthusiasm for a united Ireland, both in the South and in the North?
Well, it's certainly accelerated a debate on that issue. That's true. I mean, I think we need to focus on rebuilding relationships and ensuring that a peace process and the institutions linked to that peace process survive for now. I mean, undoubtedly, at some point in the future, there will be a very serious debate. That debate is already taking place in some communities around what the future for the island of Ireland looks like, whether that involves constitutional change, whether it doesn't, whether it involves reunification or whether it doesn't, whether we find a new way to live with each other. But certainly, the pressures that Brexit has caused in Northern Ireland and the tension, to be honest, that it has caused between Dublin and London, in relation to trying to solve problems together, has resulted in many, kind of fast forwarding their thinking, if you like, and looking at more radical solutions than maybe otherwise would have been on the table. That's true. The final thing I'd say on this is that history tells us that when the British and Irish governments work together to solve problems, then that creates a stable atmosphere in Northern Ireland to allow parties to work together also. When the British and Irish governments do not act in partnership together, then that reinforces difference, tension, polarization in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, that has been what has been happening. And so it is really important that the British and Irish governments find a way of working together on sensitive issues like the implementation of the protocol, like how we manage the legacy of the past, how we move forward together in a spirit of reconciliation, given the tensions and violence and horrors of the past. And these are all areas that are under discussion at the moment.
Do you think in your lifetime you're going to see United Ireland?
I don't know, and I don't think it's helpful for me to publicly talk about timelines for that. I am a nationalist, I suppose, a constitutional nationalist. I would like to see reunification at some point in the future. But I think what's more important than that for now is to try and build relationships between nationalists and unionists and others in Northern Ireland, so that we can focus on solving the significant disruptors that are in need of solutions at the moment. And I think we've got to find a way of solving the issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol linked to Brexit. We have to find a way of putting new structures and institutions in place to deal with the legacy of the past, which is currently also under discussion. We have to manage the build-up to elections in Northern Ireland. And of course, the centenaries that are happening in Ireland at the moment, which are, of course, are also very sensitive. So, for example, this year marks 100 years since the partition of the island of Ireland and the establishment of Northern Ireland. For some people, that's a cause for celebration. For others, it is very much the opposite. It was the start of repression and discrimination and so on against certain communities. So, these are difficult issues. They're emotive issues that we have to try to work through together, which is why it's so important that the British and Irish governments act in a spirit of partnership and trust. And unfortunately, that hasn't always been the case in the context of Brexit.
We'll talk about the Security Council. What is it in the wake of what's going on in Afghanistan that the Security Council is most concerned about now? Are they worried about spillover? Are they worried about problems that are caused by the exit?
All these things, in truth. Look, first of all, can I say that a relatively small country like Ireland doesn't often get the chance to be centre stage in the Security Council. Once every 20 years, we've managed to compete to be on the Security Council for 2 years. It's normally a competitive process, as it was this time. And of course, the highlight of our 2-year stint on the Security Council is when we hold the presidency, when we sit in the chair, and that's this month. We have a history of actually sitting in the chair of the Security Council at times of sort of extraordinary pressure and change internationally. The last time we had the presidency of the Security Council was just after 9/11, 20 years ago, which really changed the course of history.
Do you think that maybe you won't get it next time because all this?
Maybe people will be afraid to put us on the Security Council. Well, I mean, look, I think now, what's very clear, first of all, within the UN and in the Security Council is that the number and the scale of the challenges that forum is now dealing with continues to grow and accelerate. So 20 years ago, when we were last on the Security Council was dealing with 13 international files. In other words, conflicts in different parts of the world. Today, I think the figure is 34. So it's almost trebled in terms of conflict. We are living in a world that has 74 million people living in refugee camps. We have ongoing conflict in places like Yemen, Syria. We have a completely changed Afghanistan over the space of a number of weeks. We are trying to find a way of facilitating elections and creating stability in Libya. We're trying to prevent a civil war in Ethiopia, which, let's not forget, is a country of 110 million people, and should it break up, would cause extraordinary regional tension on the Horn of Africa, which is already a very fragile part of that continent. So the scale of the challenges we're facing in terms of the country files is like it's never been before in terms of scale. And then on the policy side, just yesterday, Ireland chaired the Security Council and is working towards trying to get agreement on a resolution on recognising climate and climate change as an accelerator and driver of conflict, which is something we've been working on for months now with a number of other countries, including the United States.
Are you concerned that there, in the wake of Afghanistan, maybe less interest in peacekeeping around the world?
Oh no, I think the opposite, actually. But I think Afghanistan is, of course, one of the key priorities. The international community has to act quickly, or a country of nearly 40 million people could implode and again cause enormous human suffering and mass movement of people. Let's not forget, we're already talking about a number in the millions in terms of internally displaced people in Afghanistan, and in the hundreds of thousands who are crossing borders into countries like Iran and Pakistan and others, countries that are not well equipped to deal with those kind of numbers of refugees. So, this is a really difficult challenge, in particular for the United States, given the connection and the history with Afghanistan over the last 2 decades and the sacrifice that the US has made in efforts to change and modernize Afghanistan, with a lot of success, actually, in that 20-year period.
Are there 1 or 2 things that the international community really, from where you sit, needs to do soon?
Yes. So there needs to be pragmatic engagement with the Taliban leadership. That's not easy, given the fact that nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to recognize the Taliban and won't be formally recognizing them anytime soon, I expect. But there is a need for engagement to try to influence their decisions to the maximum extent possible, to protect women and girls in particular in Afghanistan from regressing massively back to where they were 20 years ago. But we've also got to get enormous quantities of humanitarian aid into that country. And the Taliban have made clear in their communications to date that while they know how to fight, they do not know how to run a country. And so they are effectively inviting in aid convoys already across the Pakistan border They are talking to the UN about the need for enormous quantities of aid to get to rural parts of Afghanistan before the winter sets in. And so, I think we've got to try to split this challenge into humanitarian, political, and also, with a lens of, human rights protections. And the temptation, of course, given what's happened in recent weeks in Afghanistan, is to shun the Taliban, isolate the Taliban, punish the Taliban. That, of course, is what I think people would like to do. But the consequences of that for 38 million people in that country would be devastating. And so the international community has to find a way through, in my view, UN organizations to get a financial system functioning that can allow doctors and nurses and teachers to be paid, that can get food and medicines into communities and in some cases cities that need that, while at the same time trying to politically influence the Taliban to the greatest extent possible using the pressure points that we have to try to ensure a more moderate form of government and a more inclusive government than is currently present in the caretaker government, if you like, that the Taliban has announced.
I want to go to Ben Judah. He's a senior fellow at the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and he's going to ask you a question.
Hi, Ben.
Oh.
Sorry, Ben, we can't hear you. There, you.
Sorry.
Great.
Thank you. Is the Irish government concerned that it has shredded relations with the unionist community in Northern Ireland, with new moderate leaders like Doug Beattie and many who voted Remain, saying that relations have not been worse for many years? What practical steps does the Irish government plan to take to repair relations with the other side of the divide in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I met Doug Beattie last week in Belfast, and I'll meet him again in the next few weeks. In fact, I'm in Belfast again next Tuesday or Wednesday. I think for unionists that voted against Brexit, and many of them did, let's not forget, just for the audience who are listening, a strong majority of people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit, as it happens. But the United Kingdom as a whole collectively voted for it, so it's moved ahead. But as a result of that, communities in Northern Ireland are split. It is true that the relationship between the unionist community and the Irish government, largely because of the Brexit debates and the solutions that were finally agreed upon, has been very strained. I would like to try to improve that relationship and to rebuild trust, which I think is necessary. I think one of the ways in which we can do that is to show that we are genuine about trying to find a way of implementing the protocol in a way that responds to the real and practical problems that the unionist community have pointed to with that protocol, and of course to the sense of identity loss that many in the unionist community feel. And I recognize that. I've spoken to many unionist politicians and business people in relation to how we might be able to do that. And we will continue to do that. Many in the unionist community mightn't realize it, but actually the Irish government wants the absolute minimum level of trade disruption. We don't want borders anywhere. We didn't want the British, we didn't want the United Kingdom to leave the European Union at all. And even after they left, we tried to persuade them to stay in a shared customs union, to stay in a shared single market. So the Irish government doesn't want borders or friction or tension anywhere, north, south, or east, west. And we will work with the European Union to try to ensure that as much flexibility as possible is adopted in the context of the protocol and its implementation to reduce to the maximum extent possible checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And I think hopefully by doing that and by working with all political parties, including unionist parties in those efforts, we can rebuild some trust. That process needs to happen over the next few weeks. Because we don't have months here, we have weeks. If we can get a settled acceptance of the protocol in the context of the flexibilities that I talk about, if we can get agreement on how to deal with legacy issues, the legacy of the past, which I hope we'll be able to with the British government and with parties in Northern Ireland and with victims groups, and if we can maintain North-South cooperation and the political institutions right up until elections next May, well, then I think we can improve relationships and over time put the tension and polarization impact of Brexit and the protocol issues behind us. But there's a lot of work to do there. And that work involves me reaching out and working with others, but it also involves the unionist community being willing to do the same. That's the offer from the Irish government.
I'm going to go to an audience question. What is the view in Dublin about the UK's proposed amnesty measures concerning political violence during the Troubles?
Yeah, so we are strongly opposed to the approach that the UK government has, they haven't adopted. So I think it's important to say that, and when you speak to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, he will say the British government has put proposals on the table. They are a matter for discussion and consultation and negotiation. So the background to this is that back in 2015, the British and Irish governments worked together with parties in Northern Ireland to agree structures and a basis for dealing with the legacy of the past. And what that means is, how do you deal with the crimes and the atrocities and the murders that happened in Northern Ireland in the past? And we agreed an approach in an agreement called the Stormont House Agreement, which is an intergovernmental agreement between the British and Irish governments, and it was endorsed by all of the parties with the exception of one, the UUP, the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. And so about a year ago, the British government effectively decided that they were no longer committed to that agreement and wanted a different approach on dealing with the legacy of the past. The Stormont House Agreement effectively set up structures to deal with investigations of those atrocities and also to deal with reconciliation and essentially the writing of a history around the context in which those troubles happened. The British government have effectively come forward now to say that they don't believe that the Stormont House Agreement is working. I mean, the reason for that is that it hasn't been implemented, right? So how can you expect an agreement to work if it's not implemented? But instead of Stormont House, they have now said that what they would like to do is to introduce what's called a statute of limitations, which would prevent any legal cases being taken, civil or criminal, for any of the crimes that happened before the peace agreement in 1998. In other words, many people will see this as simply an amnesty.
And the families
and
of
just,
lost people
just to be clear,
don't want this to happen.
Just to be clear, nobody wants this to happen except the British government. So all of the parties in Northern Ireland, unionist and nationalist, and neither, have come forward to say this is absolutely not the way to do this. All of the victims groups have come forward to say, please don't do this. Many of us have been waiting for years to try to get the truth about what happened to our loved ones. And the Irish government has said, please don't do this. Let's try and find another way forward. If you're not committed to Stormont House any longer, okay, we think that's a mistake, but we're of course willing to try and find another way forward. So we agreed, the Secretary of State and I, in the springtime, to lead a process of consultation with victims groups and with parties in Northern Ireland to find a new way forward to deal with the legacy of the past and all of the trauma that flows from that. And we have yet to agree an approach. And our message to the British government is clear. Nobody is asking for what you're proposing. Nobody wants that. And even though that may be consistent with an election manifesto of the Conservative Party in the last general election, in terms of their relationship with veterans and so on, who they don't want to see pursued through the courts, we have got to focus on legacy on the basis of what's good for Northern Ireland and its communities. And we've got to get agreement with the people who matter here, who are the victims and their families. So when I mentioned earlier the need for partnership between the two governments, the idea that on the most sensitive political issue in Northern Ireland, which is how to deal with the atrocities of the past, that either government, the British or Irish government, would act unilaterally without working together would really be quite extraordinary. And that is why we have been so clear in our messaging. Yes, let's work together and find a new way forward if you don't agree with the previous agreement, but do not act and legislate unilaterally in a way that I think would re-traumatize in many ways many families of victims of killings in the past.
We have several audience questions along the lines here. They were wanting to know about the EU. And I also was very interested that people very close to Boris Johnson were saying that the EU is basically, yesterday's news. It doesn't work. Quote, living out of a foreign policy of a world that has gone. And
Well, if that was the case, I think other countries would be leaving the EU. They're not. In fact, lots of countries are lining up to join the EU. So I think the UK is on its own here. I think many in the United Kingdom predicted that once the UK made the decision to leave the European Union, many other countries would follow. No other countries are following. And as I said, lots of countries in the Balkans and on the eastern borders of the European Union desperately want to join the European Union. So, in a world where multilateralism matters, where unions matter, when we have to solve problems together, the idea that countries would want to go it alone, to my mind, makes no sense at all. So yes, there are faults in the European Union. There are frustrations that decisions aren't made more quickly, that compromise is often needed to get consensus. This is a union of sovereign countries. It's not a United States of Europe. And we agreed to pool sovereignties in areas where it makes sense. And this has been, just for what it's worth, for Irish people who are listening, the European Union has been an extraordinary force for positive change in Ireland, in terms of workers' rights, environmental rights, providing a platform for international investment, currency stability. The Irish economy is strong, is based on exports, is based on a globalized view of the world. And all of that has come about by the stability that the European Union has provided. Of course, I respect Britain's right to effectively go it alone. They have a new foreign policy strategy now, which is Global Britain. We actually have a foreign policy strategy which is called Global Ireland, and it's about doubling Ireland's footprint across the world, and we're setting about doing that by 2025. We've opened new embassies strategically all over the world in the last few years, but we do it as a member of the European Union. It doesn't undermine our sovereignty. It actually enhances it. But more importantly, as a small country that wants to impact on the big debates in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, on climate change, on humanitarian assistance in different parts of the world, we can do that because we have a stage to influence decision-making as one of 27 countries that agreed to work together on a daily basis. And of course, it influences our capacity to argue and influence decisions in Washington too, because Washington knows that Ireland is a friend, at least I certainly hope they do, but the fact that Ireland has an influence within the European Union allows us to influence the transatlantic relationship in a way that we otherwise would have no opportunity to do. So, there will be critics and skeptics in the United Kingdom that will want to justify the decision to leave, and they will continue, I think, to criticize and in some cases undermine the European Union. But I think within the European Union, that is not the conversation. That's the conversation in the country that's decided to leave and is effectively trying to justify that decision to themselves.
But the rollout of the vaccine in the COVID era in the EU did cause problems. It was very slow, and there was a lot of concern, and it was a matter of life and death for many people. Did that affect?
Well, I mean,
how did
Ireland,
it affect?
Well, I mean, let's deal with the facts here rather than the perceptions and the spin. Ireland today has 90% of its adults vaccinated. All of its vaccination has come from EU coordination. We've made a decision.
Are you saying it wasn't slow?
No, I'm saying it had a bad start, but there were very few countries in the world that got off to the right start in relation to managing COVID. But the European Union is 27 countries who were all grappling with COVID at the same time, as indeed the United States was, as Britain was, and so on. The United Kingdom actually had a very successful deployment of vaccines. They were one of the first in the world, along with Israel. But since then, actually the vaccination levels in Ireland have overtaken that of the UK. And I don't say that in sort of a competitive way, but I'm just saying, as a small country, and I think we have to be honest about Ireland's place in the world. As a small country, the idea that we could have had a more successful vaccination programme if we were competing with the 26 other EU member states, all to try to get our hands on vaccine at the same time, and that the friction that would have caused would have actually been a better outcome than the EU collectively doing this together. If you look at vaccination rates across the European Union, they compare very favourably now to virtually any other part of the world. We made mistakes at the start. Companies let us down in terms of supply, and there was criticism for that at the start. But I think if you look at it now in the round, was there any other part of the world where 27 countries together centrally sourced hundreds of millions of vaccines and have got the vast majority of their population now vaccinated? I'm not sure you could point to any other part of the world that's come anywhere close to that.
Well, I'm sure many people who are listening online have relatives back in Ireland, and just to be clear, there was a lot of concern there for a long time.
Well, at the start, everybody desperately wanted to get their hands on vaccines, and they wanted to see vaccines approved by the European Medicines Agency and so on. And yes, mistakes were made at the start. Contracts were signed up to that weren't delivered on, and that created frustration. But
you don't think it affects the EU like that?
No,
because there was thinking there and in other places that, see, this is an example of why we shouldn't be in the union.
Yeah, and that was the focus at the start when everybody wanted vaccine and couldn't get it, and lots of countries were in that space, by the way, including the United States. But I think we have to look back on COVID now. From start to finish. And I think the European Union needs to be judged on the basis of its mistakes and its successes. But I think collectively sourcing and distributing and avoiding the tensions that would have otherwise happened between countries as everybody grappled to try to get their hands on vaccines. I think while the European Union did make mistakes in the first few months, they've done a pretty impressive job over the last 12 months or so. And not only, by the way, in providing vaccines for the European Union, but in providing vaccines for the rest of the world. No part of the world has exported more vaccines than the EU. None. Including the countries that actually tried to point a finger at the EU in terms of mistakes at the outset.
Since the Ireland that my own parents left in 1950s, the economy in Ireland has done tremendous things. And I think a lot of people talk about three things in particular that have made the country so strong. The EU, certainly, but
has helped, yes.
The investment in education, huge, and a very low corporate tax rate. You go to Ireland, you see Facebook and Google, and my first cousins who are still over there have jobs that once they would have had to leave to have. I guess the question now is, when the Biden administration is looking for a global minimum tax rate and doesn't want to see Ireland or any other country, going lower because Facebook, which is really based in California, can have their headquarters there and avoid taxes. So where is Ireland now on agreeing with the Biden administration, saying that there should be a standard minimal global tax rate?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, on your context and introduction there, the success of the Irish economy is based on lots of things. Tax is one of them, but also, you're right, education, our membership of this huge union, which is barrier-free in terms of trade, and of course the fact that we speak English, the fact that we have a long, political and economic connection with the United States, which has been the source of so much foreign direct investment in Ireland, and of course investment the other way. There's about 900 US multinationals in Ireland at the moment, but there's actually 650 Irish companies in the United States, and employing well over 100,000 people across the US. So it works both ways, even though obviously the countries are very different in terms of size. But on the tax question, just in case you think I'm trying to dodge it, I'm not. We're working through the issues here. We're committed to the OECD-led process, and our Minister for Finance speaks to your secretary on this all the time, and will continue to. Ireland doesn't want to find itself isolated, but we also want to ensure that our perspective is understood here. That the perspective of small countries that are productive, that rely on exports for their economic model, that want to remain competitive, are factored into the overall plans here. This is not about just facilitating the superpowers. It's got to, the outcome at the end of this has got to be a transparent, fair tax system to make sure that big multinationals are paying their fair share of tax. But it's also got to factor in the interests of small countries as well as large ones. And that's where we're coming from. I hope we'll be able to find agreement, and I hope that'll happen in the next few weeks. But Ireland brings a perspective to this which is, I think, well understood. And at the end of all of this, if we can find a way of getting agreement on tax rates, and of course the basis upon where taxes are actually gathered, whether it's in countries that are manufacturing, designing, and producing products, or where products are consumed. All of that is a package that I hope Ireland will be able to support, but we're considering it carefully, and we're very much in the process of negotiation, and I don't want to go beyond that.
So it sounds like as part of the package, the corporate rate will go up.
Well, I can't say that for sure. That's what many people would like to see. There are a large number of countries now that back the Biden proposals, and indeed the EU proposals, because they're in a very similar space. Ireland is not in a place where we can back those proposals for now, but I hope we will be by the time the issues are concluded.
Can I ask you a question? America's soft power, people talk about soft power, and Irish soft power in some ways, or should we say influence around the world, often comes through writing. This is not like your typical Security Council question, but I was reading again this morning about Sally Rooney. She's a young Irish novelist. Yeah. Worldwide fame. Forever, it seems, a small country has really kind of way outsized influence when it comes to writing. I'd just like to hear from the foreign minister, because it is a big influence around the world.
This is part of our foreign policy. So, when I said earlier that we're looking to double our global footprint by 2025, and that project started in 2019, that means opening new embassies, and we've been doing that in places like Colombia, Chile, Morocco, Ukraine. We've been opening actually multiple new representations across North America and Canada. We've opened an embassy in New Zealand. It's a long list, and we're continuing on that journey. But that is sort of, I suppose, the structured diplomacy. The other side of our Global Ireland strategy is, how do we use Ireland's influence and soft power? How do we harness this extraordinary diaspora of about 70 million people across the world that I see as a global Irish tribe, if you like, living in different parts of the world, but still very connected to their Irishness? How do we use arts and culture? Ireland is extraordinarily privileged to have so many writers that, the President of the United States decides to quote virtually every week, whether it's Seamus Heaney or Yeats or whoever. And these are things that we want to try to use to reinforce what it means to be Irish and how Irish people view the world. We see ourselves as global citizens, and so
what is it
whether
that
it's Sally
Ireland is
Rooney or whether it's others, Irish writers create connections with Ireland and where we come from in terms of this small little island in the middle of the Atlantic between the United States and Europe, and largely driven by tragedy in the past in terms of famine and migration and so on. This Irish tribe is spread now all over the world, particularly the English-speaking world. And through our writers, through our sports people, through our politicians, through our embassy network, through our cultural attaches, we are trying to influence global decision makers across all of these spheres to the maximum extent possible. That's part of what it means to be a global citizen.
We're running out of time, but I did want to ask, what is the secret? You have a country, now 5 million people. Time and time again, you have writers who for a small country, are known internationally. Is it that what is it about something Ireland's doing? Are they putting investments in the arts, in the education, or is it some kind of gift that Irish people have to communicate?
Well, look, anybody who visits Ireland will know that Irish people like to talk and communicate. They like to build connections. They like to share perspectives, sometimes tragic, sometimes the opposite. I think that's just who we are. And for me as a foreign minister, I want to try to harness all that is positive and powerful about Irishness internationally, whether that's here on the Hill, meeting the Friends of Ireland, which is a bipartisan group, whether it's trying to ensure that we maintain the connection with the White House, particularly with an Irish-American president that is so emotionally connected to Ireland, or indeed whether it's connecting to our missionaries in and across Africa, or indeed our young teachers in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, or second and third generation Irish in Australia that at one point, made up nearly 40% of the Australian population. These are connections that Ireland is privileged to have because of our history and our past. And if we can harness them, well, then a small country that, yes, has 5 million people living in it can be a much more powerful force than many people would normally associate with a country of that size in terms of international politics, and that's my job.
I could keep talking to you forever, but I've gotten the signal here that we have run out of time, but I am so appreciative for you to be here in Washington. There's so much going on in the world. A small country has done a lot and continues to do a lot, and I'm grateful.
Could I say one thing to finish, just because of the audience that I'm speaking to and the organization that's organizing this event in terms of the Atlantic Council? It's a real privilege for me to be here. One of the things that I would like Ireland to be in the months and years ahead is a catalyst to try to build a closer relationship between the United States and Europe. We already have a good foundation for that relationship, but I think particularly with this president and the team around him, there really is an extraordinarily positive opportunity for the EU and the United States, and indeed Atlantic states more generally, to work more closely together in a world that's changing, and in a world that needs, in my view, that alliance to be much stronger and more consistent through presidencies. Both from a trade and economic perspective, but actually as importantly from a political perspective and a humanitarian perspective. There are forces that are growing in the world today that we need to be aware of and respond to, and countries that share common values in terms of how the world should function and how we should protect vulnerable people need to work together, in my view, in a much closer way than we have been. And I hope that Ireland can be a catalyst that helps that to happen, given our relationship with the United States, which remains so close, and given our membership of the European Union, which we're so committed to. I think we are ideally placed to help to facilitate that.
And the top priority, if you could just finish that sentence, the top priority for Ireland with this new the Biden administration is a closer relationship because what? What is it that is the number one thing?
Well, I think that there is an opportunity now. I believe that President Biden understands Europe well, wants to build a closer alliance with European friends and allies. If you look at his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who speaks fluent French, understands the European Union also, I think, very well. I can tell you, within the European Union, within its institutions, there is also a stronger commitment than I have ever seen to actually build a structured relationship transatlantic, where perhaps for the first time, we don't see the Atlantic as a barrier, but we see it as a connector between these two continents that share a very similar outlook on life and share a similar view as to how we should be influencing other parts of the world for the better. And I think if we can build on that level of ambition, then I think the United States and Europe together, given, as I say, other influencers on world affairs who perhaps don't share our value system, can be a necessary force for good in the decades ahead.
Well done. Thanks very much. Appreciate
Thank you.
Appreciate
Anytime.
everybody for joining us on the live stream, and I appreciate you coming into the Atlantic Council.